Welcome to A Pair of Bookends, the book club you can carry anywhere. I'm your host, Hannah MacDonald, and I'll be bookending the conversation with some of the most exciting voices from the bookish world. Hello, and welcome back to our debut Spotlight series, where we shine the light on the freshest authors and their work. Today, the spotlight is on Rachel Blackmore and her historical novel, Costanza. A tale as old as time, a powerful man harming a woman and the denial of her narrative. In Costanza, Rachel flips history on its head and explores what Costanza's story might actually be. An urgent and powerful novel of obsession, betrayal and resilience, it is unsurprising that this has already stole the hearts of many. Rachel Blackmore is a writer based in London. She studied history at King's College London, and after a brief stint in politics, she built a career in corporate communications. Although her fascination in history and women's stories began early in her life, it wasn't until her mid-40s that Rachel took the leap and channeled those things into writing fiction. In 2021, she was runner-up in the Harper's Bazaar short story competition and won the Irish Writers' Centre 2022 Novel Fair. Her debut novel, Costanza, is out now and published by Renegade Books. And here to chat all about it, welcome Rachel to A Pair of Bookends.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you.
I'm so excited to chat to you, and I must say you are responsible for many late nights. So I've had a pretty sleepless week because of this book. So I don't know whether to thank you for that or be annoyed at you.
I feel slightly sorry, not sorry about that.
Yeah. I can imagine. So let's start us off by asking my favourite question, which is, what are you currently reading?
So I'm reading a novel that's going to be out at the end of January. I've been lucky enough to get a proof, and it's The Artist by Lucy Steeves. And this is a historical fiction novel set in Provence in the 1920s. Yes. And I met Lucy earlier this year, and she told me that The Artist came from a very small sentence in a very large book about art history. I know of no notable female forgers in the history of forgery. And so Lucy has written a novel all about a female forger, because there must have been one at some point. We just don't know who she was.
That sounds incredible. I need to get my hands on a copy of this.
Do. It's great.
Who's it published by?
It is published by John Murray.
Oh, amazing. They're publishing so many great things. So I'm excited for that one. It's going to be added to my list. And I've got a feeling you're going to be adding many books to my list, because you said before we started recording, you did tell me that you've got a recommendation for me, which is a book that we will mention later, hands to everyone, so I'm really excited for that. I was curious, actually, about your reading taste. Have you always been drawn to historical fiction, or at what point in your life did you find that you loved historical fiction, you were inspired by it?
I've always loved history. Ever since I was at primary school, I've always loved history. And I probably started reading historical fiction in my early teens. Mm-hmm. And Jean Plaidy was my gateway drug into historical fiction. And I used to eat up those little white books with pictures of rather 1970s looking Tudor women on the front. And then I progressed to Philippa Gregory and those kinds of books. And I think more recently, we've had Hilary Mantel and Maggie O'Farrell, and historical fiction used to be a very small shelf at the back of the bookshop. Mm-hmm. And now we see historical fiction on every main table in every bookshop. So I think there's been an evolution of historical fiction, which I'm really pleased about, because I think a lot of people pick up historical fiction and don't necessarily even think about the fact that it is historical fiction.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've said it on the podcast a couple of times before that I don't know where I got this idea from, but I really didn't think historical fiction was for me. I don't know if I'd read a really dense book at some point in my teenage years or something like that, but somewhere along the way, something had put me off. And I always just kind of pushed it to the side and was like, no, I'm not going for it. And then doing the podcast, I've started to read more outside of my literary fiction genre that I was kind of attached to. And I've delved into so many incredible historical novels, and I'm completely obsessed now. And I just love this book so much. So as I said before, thank you for writing this. Before we touch on Costanza, I do want to ask about your journey as a debut author. You wrote on Instagram, and obviously I mentioned in my intro that you didn't actually start writing fiction seriously until your mid 40s. What made you take the leap?
Yeah, I'd always wanted to write fiction, and I've written in my day job for years and years and
Hmm.
years. But I think in my mid 40s, two things happened. First of all, my children grew up to a point where I finally had a little bit of headspace. I think it's
Hmm.
very small. When you have very small children, there is very little mental space for anything else.
Hmm.
And finally, I could close the door and tell them to get on with whatever they were getting on with and be left alone for an hour or two. And it's a big thing, I
Yeah.
think, for especially women writers to find that space. And the second was I was made redundant from my job, and I just started to think about writing fiction. And then I was made redundant in the middle of the pandemic. And I had this moment of thinking, if I don't do it now, there will never be another moment like this. And I've put it off and put it off. And I'm not going to do that any longer. So I just started to write, and I started to write Costanza in the middle of lockdown. And it's one of the reasons I went for competitions, because I literally had no writing CV. So I thought, what's the quickest way
Yeah.
that I can start to build my writing CV?
And what was it like writing through lockdown? Did you find that it was quite a good outlet for you, or did it feel quite intense? Like, what was that experience like?
So I was probably trying to do two things at the same time. I think learning to write fiction is a craft. I
Yeah.
think it's a skill set, and I think you have to learn it,
Yes.
or at least it to be traditionally published, which is what my ambition was.
Hmm.
And so I was really lucky, because just as lockdown happened, lots and lots of support and courses and authors went online.
Yeah.
And so suddenly there was actually quite a wealth of support and help online that I was able to access. And also, I think there was a quietening of our daily lives and our
Yeah.
daily routines. And I think that that helped me immensely
Yeah.
to learn and to write at the same time. And I think it would be much more difficult trying to do the day-to-day routine as it's got back to normal,
Hmm.
and fit the novel in as well.
Yeah.
So I think being in lockdown did help, but also the incredible generosity of the writing community who
Hmm.
went online to support other writers.
Yeah, I've been listening to your podcast with the London Writers Salon, and it sounds like they were a wonderful community for you. What was it like working with them? Because I don't really know how that works. So could you talk a bit about what it was like being within that community and how they helped you on your journey as a debut author?
So, the London Writers' Salon is an international community of writers, and at the centre of it are people who've been within the publishing industry. So, you get a huge amount of, I suppose, moral support and cheerleaders
Yeah.
from other writers who are working alongside you. But you also get access to industry knowledge and support and understanding.
Hmm.
They run something called Writers' Hour, which is a free resource even now,
Oh,
and they were
wow.
running it, I think, 2 or 3 times a day. And you log on for an hour, and at the top of the hour, you say, "Today, I'm going to try and finish this scene, or I'm going to write some dialogue." And they have one rule, which is that you can write and not do anything else. So you either write or you don't do anything else, but you
Yeah.
write in community silently with other writers. And there's something about accountability in doing
Hmm.
that. And there's also something about company in what can be quite a lonely pursuit at times.
Yeah.
So it's been instrumental, not just in my writing journey,
Hmm.
but lots of people's writing journeys. And I really would ask people to go and check them out if they're just starting out. It's a fantastic community of writers.
That sounds incredible. And I think it is so difficult. You can put it off and put it off that I need to sit down and write. I want to sit down and write. So actually having that kind of time carved out for you and knowing that you're sitting down with this community and you've got to get it done, I imagine that was incredibly helpful because I'm constantly saying I want to go back to my writing and I just put it off and put it off, and then I find, oh look, months have passed and I've not written anything. And actually being able to sit down and work on something and have that time would be incredibly useful. So I think I'm going to try knowing that now. I also wanted to ask, because I believe that your dad is a theatre director, or was a theatre director. Was arts and culture something that was encouraged in your household? Was it quite a big part of your household growing up? Yeah, I was just curious about that, and whether storytelling was something that started quite early on.
Absolutely. So dad was a theatre director, mum was a teacher. They were both incredibly interested in the arts, and not just theatre, but the visual arts and cinema. And we were encouraged to be curious about the world. And I think one of the things about seeing a lot of theatre, which obviously I did growing up because that was my dad's job,
Yeah.
is that I was very immersed in oral storytelling, because essentially that's what theatre is. And I do think that that reflects in my style of writing, and the fact that I went on to be a speechwriter myself. So the way that I construct not just dialogue, but also the way that I write is very much about words that are written to be heard, not just read. And I think that's something that's quite important as writers, that, you know, when you're listening to an audio book and a writer's thought about how it will sound being read out loud, it's a different experience. So absolutely. And both visual art, so paintings, sculptures, and film, as well as other books, very much inspired me when I was writing Costanza. I had a kind of little suite of inspiration from different kind of cultural paths, as you were, which I used when I was writing Costanza.
I think it makes a lot of sense to me, especially when I heard that your dad was a theatre director, and I imagined that was part of your world growing up. I think it definitely comes across, like you said, in your writing. There's a real kind of like visual quality to your work. It's very visceral, so it just feels like, yeah, you immerse us in that world completely in the way that you write about these characters and the setting. I would love it if you could read a little section from Costanza to give the listeners a little taste of the book.
I would be delighted. So I've chosen to read the prologue, which is called Bad Omens Gather. And we are in Rome in August 1638, in the middle of a heat wave. Despite the great heat, the man is hurrying, half walking, half running through the streets of Rome. It is mid-morning, the sun is high, and all those who are gainfully employed are hard at work. The roads throng with sellers, and the air hums with the strident percussion of stonemasons and carpenters, a strange, clanging, sawing anthem played for the glorification of God. Bad omens are gathering, so say the superstitious. This heat, they whisper, is lethal. The old and the sick, their bodies already dry from age and ague, are dying quicker than they can be buried. Then there was that Barnabite priest on his knees praying in the San Carlo an Cantarani when he was struck by lightning. Tell me that is not a sign of divine displeasure. Someone's neighbour heard from her sister's friend that the Holy Father was covered in lesions, great fronds of fire creeping across his body as he drew his last breath, not to mention the Jewish quarter being set ablaze, flames tearing through the tinder box houses. It is all a sign. Dust flies up from the man's feet, covering his breeches, gritting his eyes, causing him to spit out dry grime from his mouth. He feels intensely alive, more alive than he has ever felt before. His body quivers, delighting in the quickening of muscles which tense and stretch against his bones with each step. This man is a servant to an artist, a famous sculptor who creates the likenesses of popes and kings from marble. So real, people think the stone heads might start talking at any moment. The manservant carries 2 flagons of wine. His palms are slick and wet with sweat, and he is glad for the twine which has been twisted around the top of each bottle to prevent slippage. He grips harder, the harsh fibres of the rope pushing against his palms, rubbing small welts into the skin, but he does not register this mortification of the flesh. In the pocket of the servant's breeches is a razor, carefully folded in against itself. He feels the reassuring heft of it, banging in a constant rhythm, thud, 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 against his leg as he scurries on. The blade is the type artists use, finest money can buy. The edge of its gleaming metal has been shaved against the whetstone, sharpened for the particular purpose of harm. The servant has his orders, very specific instructions. Today he shall deliver justice. He hastens, heart pounding, with the potential, the possibility, the anticipation of his deed.
So good. It's so good. I love it so much, and you read that so beautifully. Are you reading the audiobook for this book?
Oh, no, no, no. There's the amazing Esther has become Costanza. She's absolutely incredible.
But your voice is incredible reading that. I loved that so much. And I'm so glad that we got to give the listeners a taste, because it is such a beautiful book. And I think, I described it before as saying it's very sensory, and you immediately feel immersed in this world. And, you can feel the heat, and you can, see these people walking the streets. And I think as well, the food descriptions in the book are incredible as well. I absolutely loved them. And I even wrote a quote down where you say, food is like language, it anchors us. And there's this beautiful piece about food and the meaning of it, and it connecting family. And I love that so much. Obviously, we spoke before about how you think theatre plays a role in your writing style, but what else do you think helps you write these sort of sensory descriptions?
Well, I'm also really inspired by other writers, and I've always enjoyed novels that are quite rich in their description, that don't spare us, that actually plunge us into place and time. And I also think when you're writing historical fiction, you're recreating a time and place that nobody's ever seen or visited. Rome of the 1600s is a building site. It's, we can't imagine it now. We try to in novels. And I think it's the job, particularly in historical fiction, to try and best we can create the world in which our characters are living. And the way that we can do that is through, description and trying to take our readers through the full gamut of senses in the material world in which our characters are living.
I'm curious what writers you feel have inspired your work.
I particularly love Maggie O'Farrell. I think her writing has that sometimes you get propulsion in a novel, sometimes you get beautiful description in a novel, sometimes you get deep characterization. But I think she's a writer who does all three.
Yeah.
And I just remember reading Hamnet and thinking, oh gosh, if I could write anything near this, that would be amazing. So yes, Maggie O'Farrell, a fangirl. I'm definitely a fangirl.
I love that. I've still not read Hamnet. It's sat on my shelf, and I go on holiday at the end of this month, and I feel like I have to take it with me. I've been told that it'll make me cry, but
yes, it will do. That's the only.
I'm willing to accept that, because I love her writing style. And yeah, I can definitely see the influence now that you've said that. I want to talk about your protagonist Costanza, because she is obviously the center of this story, and you wrote in your author's note of how you first came across her story. Could you tell the listeners a bit about how you first learned about the real Costanza?
Absolutely. So I was researching a trip to Rome, and I was watching a BBC documentary, and there were two male art historians talking about the genius of Bernini. And when you go to Rome, it is Bernini. there's Bernini everywhere. And they were talking about his career and the influence that he'd had on art. And then they mentioned his mistress, and it was almost termed in kind of, and then there was this unfortunate incident where he ordered an attack on her. And then it went back to the genius of Bernini. And I became really haunted by this woman. She wasn't even named in the exchange. And I went away and I did some research, and I discovered that her name was Costanza. And one of the things that both my publisher and I were really set on right from the beginning was that the novel would be called Costanza. We
I
would
love
give
that.
her name
Yeah.
back. She was 22. She came from quite a poor background. She was the wife of an atelier in Bernini's workshop. He was nearly 40 or 40 or thereabouts. At the absolute height of his powers, he was essentially a superstar. He had enormous power. He could just go and see the Pope without making an appointment.
Oh my gosh.
And the power dynamics were, to me, immediate,
Yeah.
absolutely immediate. And I did what I think a lot of writers do, which is portioned her away in a little part of my brain to think I might come back to her. And when I came back to her, it was something else that happened during lockdown. And there was a young woman called Sarah Everard who was murdered at the hands of a man in lockdown. And my local community of women decided to hold just a small vigil in our local park. But we had to socially distance, so we stood a metre apart from each other. We didn't talk. We all lit candles and stood there in silence. And there was something very visceral in that moment. The women ranged from their 20s to their 70s. And each one of us understood how it had happened and understood what had happened to Sarah. And it was really moving. And I came home, and at the same time, my young daughters, I was starting to try and teach them about how to stay safe in the world. But they were too young for me to explain what I was trying to keep them safe from. And I felt a dual despair and rage, a despair that my generation was meant to be different. We were meant to change things. I think every generation thinks they're going to be different. And this story that repeats itself over and over and over again, and violence against women is not falling, it's not changing, it's it's as entrenched in society as it was, but also absolute rage. I wanted to do something about it, so I did what any writer does, which is I reached for a story, and the story I reached for was Costanza's, because many people have heard of Gian Lorenzo Bernini. Many people know his story, and very few people outside of art history specialists had heard Costanza's story. And I think part of the thing that we can contribute as writers is to resurface the narratives, because I think if we can't even hear the voices, if we don't even know the stories, how are we ever going to change it? So that's how I came to write Costanza's story, to give her a voice. I mean, I know very little about her. She's, especially her early life, she wasn't worthy of note in her early life. So much of it is imagined, but I very much drew on being 22 myself.
Yeah. I mean, it's a beautiful imagining of her life, and I said to you before that the author's note I felt really moved by. You writing about Sarah Everard and how you channeled that into the writing of the pain and the resilience that the characters in your book experience. And I think, as you said, like it's so insane that nothing's really changed. We've seen that just this week, we've had the news of and I'm going to butcher the pronunciation of their names, but it's Giselle Pellico, I don't know how you pronounce
Yeah,
her name, and
yeah.
also the Olympian Rebecca Cheptegei, I think that's how you say your name. These stories are so unbelievably harrowing, and it sometimes makes you feel a bit powerless. So I'm glad that you found that outlet with writing. Do you find other ways to kind of push yourself forward and not allow yourself to feel powerless in it?
I don't know whether I feel powerless. I feel rage, and I feel that
Yeah,
we have to actually have a significant social conversation, not
yeah,
just at a national but international level.
yeah.
And we actually have to talk about what is happening and why it is happening. I mean, we also have the trial in France going on at the moment of
Yeah,
a
yeah,
woman who was drugged and by her husband.
yeah.
So I think actually it is incumbent on us to be louder and to talk more and to tell more stories and demand more and
Yeah.
to actually ask why and not just pretend it's not happening. So, I suppose this is one way of trying to wrest power back.
Yeah.
But we do have to have a significant conversation about how we start to tackle the very, very serious issue of violence against women and girls in our society.
100%. And the statistics are are frightening. You also wrote about that in your author's note about the statistics. I think it was you were referencing 2020 or 2021 about the amount of girls that are actually not only being killed but being killed in their own home and at the hands of, a partner that they live with. And it's frightening. And I know that you did a lot of research for this book into coercive control. And I was curious about what that research kind of helped you with in terms of your writing, and how you went about kind of plotting out the dynamic between Lorenzo and Costanza, because he's this very kind of attractive, appealing, sort of persuasive man, very charismatic. And I mean, you can see the reality of it. Like you said, this documentary was all about the genius of him.
I mean, one of the things that does give me hope is that we're understanding what happens more and more and more. And there's an incredible woman, Jane Monckton Smith, who was a former police officer and is now a professor. And she's done some incredible work on tracking the 8 stages of coercive control in intimate partner violence that escalates often to homicide and to severe violence. And these events are entirely predictable. We can track them, we can predict them. And the more the police and social services and women and society can see the patterns, the more that we should be able to intervene. And what was really shocking was I read that book just as part of my research, that she wrote a book called In Control, which I recommend everybody reads. And I read that book thinking that it would be really useful background information for writing the novel. And I had this moment where my blood ran cold, because what I was reading in this contemporary book about the psychology of coercive control mirrored the pattern of Gian Lorenzo Benini's relationship with Costanza. And there were moments in her story that are trigger points, that we know are trigger points, that he perpetrated. And at that point, I decided to use those 8 stages as actual plot points in the novel. And everybody thinks that these are crimes of passion, when women are harmed in intimate partner violence. They're not. They're premeditated, and they can be predicted. And because they're premeditated and can be predicted, we could stop more than we do. So I took a very deliberate decision to track those 8 stages. Because there is something very convincing about charismatic, persuasive, articulate men. And especially in a society in which women are taught that, getting married or being loved or being desired is your absolute goal in life. If you are desired and loved by a man, you've made it, And so it feeds into that. Yeah. It feeds into that whole pattern. So yes, I did some research thinking it would be useful background information, but it actually became the plot points of the novel.
I think it's so fascinating as well. You've just got me thinking about the language that we use around these types of men, the genius of them. And, there's a really interesting conversation happening around like how we separate art from the artist in terms of these men. And I don't really know what the answer is to that, but certainly, if there's a man that's treating a woman in such a horrific way, you'd think that I mean, in this day and age they'd be cancelled, but back then it's just a totally different world, isn't it? I want to ask actually about the world of art, and what was it like exploring the art of this kind of period? Did you have to do quite a lot of research into it?
If I'm really being honest, my historical interest and knowledge really extends to about 1600. So going into the 1630s very much like I was doing current affairs. I'd never gotten that far in history before it. We were in uncharted territory. And I really didn't know a lot about Baroque art. If I'm really being honest, I think that I probably in the past look at Baroque art and thought, it's all a bit overblown and all right, mate, calm it. It's totally mesmerizing, but it's very, very over the top to kind of modern tastes. And what I learned was that this was a very, very significant moment in the history of Rome, the history of the Catholic Church, and the history of art. And I think for writers, we're very interested in moments of change, significant change, because that's where the really good stories come from. And what had happened was that the Protestant Reformation had swept through Europe and was very much challenging the supremacy of the Catholic Church, the Church's power, the Church's wealth. And it took the Church quite a long time to get a grip. And what we see is the Counter-Reformation beginning to happen. And one of the ways that the popes and the broader church decided to counteract Protestantism was to create a whole world of art designed to shock and inspire and to awe the faithful. And what we see is artists like Caravaggio and Bernini coming through with paintings that have and sculptures that are full of drama and light, and gone are the mythic portrayals of angels on fluffy clouds, and in comes humanity as faith. So we start to see ordinary people with grimy feet, that are representing what it is, the agony and the ecstasy of everyday faith. And in Bernini, what we see is a significant shift in portraiture and in sculpture to sculpture full of dynamism and movement, and a portrayal of the extremes. I mean, he would have loved a selfie. He would have loved mobile phones. He was interested in capturing that moment of extreme ecstasy, of extreme agony. He's interested in just capturing that snapshot moment of what it is to live, and to have faith, and what God inspires in us. So that's what Baroque art is. And when you start to understand that's what these artists were not only trying to do, but being paid to do by their patrons and by the church, you start to understand the context and the impact. This art was so different to anything anybody'd ever seen before. So it must have been extraordinary when people went to see it. And it's one of the reasons why Costanza's portrait is so significant in the history of art. So normally people who've studied art history actually do say, oh yes, no, I know Costanza. Bernini created one portrait that wasn't commissioned in the whole canon of his career. And the one portrait that he wasn't paid to make was Costanza's. So we know that it's significant to him because he's not being paid, and he's a businessman through and through. He doesn't do anything if he's not got a scooty at the end of it. And he decides to create this portrait, and it's very rare in this period for us to have portraits of women. They're usually either saints or they're dead or they're duchesses, and Costanza was an ordinary woman, and normally portraits followed very strict rules of decorum. So women would be dressed in a certain way. There would be no, they would have very straight faces, lips closed, much more like medieval portraiture. And what we see in Costanza's portraiture is a vitality and a life and a vividness that had never been seen in female portraiture before. But we also see really shocking sexual elements in her portrait. So she has her mouth slightly open, she has her chemise slightly undone, she has no outer clothing on. I mean, it's a deeply, deeply intimate, sexy portrait that changed the way that women were portrayed in sculpture and in art. And that's what Costanza's bust does. And then we have her story that goes alongside it.
That's so fascinating to kind of think about the book through that lens, because I was unsure on how much is fictionalized and how much is fact, but the story of the portrait, I mean, it's a real obsession. Like, you can really see his obsession is so clear that you know that he's this big businessman and he'll only do things if it involves money. And the fact that that was the one thing in his canon of work that he did the portrait of her, it kind of makes it a little bit more unnerving, I think, learning that.
Absolutely, it makes it more unnerving. And when I was writing that scene, when she first sees it, what I had in mind was women whose images have been shared without consent.
Yes, yeah.
And so for me, when she saw that, for 400 years plus, male art historians mainly have been like, oh, she was a bit of a goer, and she was a spitfire and all of this. And I think she I think she must have known when she saw it. That's how that representation of her that was intimate and was
Yeah.
now public would be seen by particularly men through the ages. And so I did do research on the stories of women who've had images shared without consent, because that's what I was thinking of when I wrote the scene, that when she is first confronted with the portrait that he's made of her, because I doubt very much he asked for her consent.
Yeah, it makes so much sense that actually, whilst I was reading the book, I kept thinking how modern it felt and how sort of relatable these characters felt and how, these women's stories were kind of resonate with me. So it's fascinating to learn that you have been looking at this throughout with this modern lens, and that moment where he shows it to her and he's so excited and thinks it's this incredible piece of work, and she's like speechless, isn't she? And I want to tread really carefully. I don't want to give any spoilers and stuff, but his sort of treatment prior to showing her this is so kind of, I don't know what the word is. It's like he almost, in modern context, he kind of love bombs her
Absolutely.
when he first meets
Absolutely.
her, and then it
Mm.
kind of, it becomes this great love affair, and then he just kind of distances himself, almost like ghosting. It goes from love bombing to ghosting, and then this reveal, and he's just got kind of no understanding or comprehension of his actions and how his treatment might actually be affecting her. It's just really got me thinking about like the modern context of it. It's really frightening.
Absolutely. And I was writing that with those stages in mind.
Yeah,
The early stage relationship of coercive control is love bombing,
yeah,
where women feel absolutely unable to kind of say, oh, this is going a bit quickly, this is, I'm not sure, and actually feel sometimes, oh my God, he really loves me, he really desires me. And this manipulation of blowing hot and cold, of showing extreme affection and then pulling back again is a form of control and manipulation.
yeah.
And this is a man who had been, declared a child prodigy at the age of 8, who had been in control of his entire life.
Mhm.
And to me, there is that moment where, and the decision to begin the portrait is where he realizes that he has such significant feelings for her that
Mhm.
perhaps he might have lost a little bit of control. And I think particularly in that patriarchal society, and particularly his standing not only within his own family, but he was running, a big company, essentially, a
Mm,
big workshop. He was a CEO of a workshop. This is a man of very, very high social status and
yeah,
standing. And so for him to lose any kind of control or face is not acceptable in his own eyes, or probably that of wider society. And these are the conversations that we need to have. What
absolutely.
happens when men feel that they've been shamed, or that they've been embarrassed, or that's the dangerous moment, actually.
Yeah, you really get a sense of that, and I think it's so dangerous, for some men to have this power and this validation, this ongoing, this constant, validation that he receives, and he just kind of doesn't understand. If you give a man that kind of platform and they're committing these horrible things towards women, they just have kind of, he doesn't have an understanding of what he's done wrong, and we see this play out again and again and again. And it's what the whole kind of Me Too movement was about. And yeah, I can't, I'm kind of my brain is going 100 miles an hour because you've got me thinking so much about our history as women and everything that's kind of happened in recent events and kind of my own experiences. So yeah, for listeners, this is such an incredible book if that wasn't already obvious, and I feel like it will really resonate with so many women out there. And I'm just really grateful that you've written it, and yeah, thank you.
Well, it's my absolute pleasure, and I wrote it as a woman for women,
Yeah,
and I think one of I want listeners to know there's also
absolutely.
a
Yes.
hopeful element to this novel, because very much the last third of the novel, for me, is a meditation on the very deep value of my own friendships, my own female
Yes.
friendships in my life, and the role that women play behind closed doors, and the
Yeah.
support and the resilience and the building up and the love that women offer each other at
Hmm.
darkest moments of their lives. And this was very much a meditation on the power of female friendship and love,
Yeah.
and also the role that older women play in that network of women, especially women who, when you become less useful to society because you're beyond your childbearing years and you're slightly kind of marginalized and pushed to the side, or so it would seem. But actually, in my own life, and I'm sure in lots of listeners' lives, those are the women, the matriarchs, the nanas, the older women in the office, are often the women who are looking out for the younger women and playing quite significant roles in these female networks that is not always written about and not always seen. So very much that last third of the book is about the support and hope that Costanza is given. And in real life, she was an incredibly resilient woman. She was an incredible, phenomenal woman who went on to be a significant art dealer and a significant businesswoman in her own right. So I do feel that at the end of all of this, that it, for me, the novel ends on a moment of hope.
It does. It really does. It is a really hopeful ending. And like you said, the last third of the book, she's surrounded by so many women. And, I said I don't want to give any spoilers, but she's kind of in this space that she's kind of unsure of. And she's surrounded by so many women and she makes these connections and these friendships. And I think it just shows how powerful we can be, when we come together and we sort of, fight against all of this that we're faced with. It takes a lot of power and resilience, and yeah, these characters are a perfect example of that. And really loved that you ended it in that way. I really loved this book, and for our listeners, I am going to pop a link in the show notes to buy yourselves a copy if you've not already read this book. Please go and buy it. It is so incredible, and I feel like I'm going to have to go back and reread it with everything that we've spoken about today, because it's just amazing and I've got no other words left for it. It was so lovely to chat to you about Costanza. But before I let you go, I do like to round off the episode by asking for a recommendation. So that can be anything: books, TV, film, culture, anything goes.
So my recommendation is going to be the book that I've bought the most to give to other people, that I've gifted the most, and that is Still Life by Sarah Winman. It's another book about art. It's another book about found families and what art means in people's lives, but also people who don't always fit within society. And I just think it's an almost, if not perfect, novel in terms of characterization, story, plot, breadth, and the very many layers that are in that book. So if you have not read Still Life by Sarah Winman and you ever meet me, I'm very likely to press a copy into your hands.
I love that. I actually have it on my shelf and I have not read it yet.
Oh,
So
you have to go
I
and read
must
it.
get to it now. But now I'm like, I need to take both on holiday now, but are they both going to make me cry? Hamnet and Still Life.
Oh yeah, no, they probably will both make you cry.
Okay, so I need to mix it up a bit. Spread them out. Thank you so much, Rachel, for joining me today. I've absolutely loved chatting to you, and I think it's pretty evident how much I loved your book as well. So thank you so much for writing it and for coming on A Pair of Bookends.
What an absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. And for our listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to rate, review and subscribe. And if you want to give us a follow, you can do so at Pair of Bookends Pod on Instagram and at Pair of Bookends on Twitter and TikTok. And where can they follow you, Rachel?
I am on Twitter and on Instagram as Rachel Blackmore Writer.
So go give her a follow and go buy her book. Thank you so much for listening, and goodbye.